Welcome to the CCG Museum, where we research and preserve the history of old and defunct collectible card games to ensure their memory is preserved for future gamers. For today's tour, we will discuss a game that came out right in the middle of the CCG glut of 1995. It was the first effort from a company that had some real star power behind it. But would that star power be enough to sustain the game through difficult times? Let's find out. This is the story of Star of the Guardians. Star of the Guardians is a sci-fi universe created by speculative fiction author Margaret Weis. While it is a well-developed universe in its own right, one would be hard-pressed to not notice certain parallels with a certain, much more famous science fiction trilogy. The parallels are obvious enough that one could even argue that Star of the Guardians is an inverse Star Wars. Let me explain. Star Wars is about a galaxy ruled by a long-established democratic republic that is able to maintain peace with the help of space wizard Buddhist monks that use laser swords. But an evil space wizard convinces one of the good space wizards to help him knock down the republic and replace it with an evil dictatorship with him at the helm. The newly evil wizard helps to kill most of the good wizards, though a few escape the purge. Years later, one of the surviving good wizards sacrifices himself so a young orphan is able to join a ragtag band of rebels and help overthrow the oppressive empire and return the galaxy to the rightful republic it had been before. Along the way, the young boy finds out that his father is the traitor space wizard, and that this secret was kept from him for his own safety. Fortunately for the plucky rebels, the traitor space wizard turns back to the light and is instrumental in their victory. Star of the Guardians is about a galaxy ruled by a long-established benevolent dictatorship, headed by a family that holds a literal divine right to rule, which is protected by space wizard Knights Templar that use laser swords. But a space Joseph Stalin convinces one of the good knights to help him knock down the benevolent dictatorship and replace it with space communism with him at the helm. The newly evil space wizard helps to kill most of the good space wizards and the royal family, though some escape the purge. Years later, one of the surviving good wizards sacrifices himself so a young orphan is able to join a ragtag band of rebels and help overthrow the corrupt communist system and reinstate the rightful benevolent dictatorship. Along the way, the young boy finds out that he is the rightful heir to the throne, and that this secret was kept from him for his own safety. Fortunately for the plucky rebels, the traitor space wizard turns back to the light and is instrumental in their victory. Now yes, these summaries are a bit reductive, obviously. Star of the Guardians really isn't that much like Star Wars when you look at the entire story, but the similarities are pretty hard to ignore. Anyways, the game Star of the Guardians takes place during the chaotic years of the Commonwealth, when various warlords were effectively the true rulers of the galaxy, maintaining peace through force as the rule of law breaks down galaxy-wide. You take the role of one of these warlords, seeking to fill the power vacuum caused in the wake of the destruction of the monarchy. As a space warlord, you start with 25 power points. This game's equivalent to life points. The goal of the game is to reduce your opponent to 0 power points. You begin by constructing a deck with a minimum of 40 cards and a suggested maximum of 80. You can have up to 2 copies of any single card in your deck. System cards, being the basic resource, are naturally exempt from this restriction. Do take note, personality, artifact, and special system cards are all considered unique, and while you may have 2 copies in your deck, only 1 copy of them may be on the table at a time. Not that each player may have 1 copy out at a time, but only 1 copy may be on the table at a time. To begin the game, shuffle your deck and cut your opponents. Remember, you may trust your opponent, but always cut the deck. You start with an initial hand of 6 cards. The player whose turn it is called the offensive player, and the other player is the defensive player. A turn normally begins with the ready phase, which is the equivalent of the untap phase in Magic. Any used cards are rotated back to their normal position, making them ready to be used again. Next is the draw phase. If you have fewer than 3 cards in your hand, you draw up to 3. Otherwise, draw a single card. Next is the system phase, where you can play a single system card or special system card. When you play a system card or special system card, you gain 1 power point. Next, we have the deployment phase. This is when you will be playing most of your cards. There are 2 resources in Star of the Guardians. Influence is the more common resource, with personality being used as a secondary resource. All normal system cards provide 1 influence when used. Other cards, such as special system cards or personality cards, can also provide influence or personality when used. Just like in Magic, you can play cards from your hand if you can pay the resource cost for said cards. Specifically, in this phase you can play Artifact, Crew, Modifier, Personality, Ship, Squadron, and Weapon cards. Next is the offensive maneuver phase. If you have any ships on the table, you can move them around. Pay attention, because ship movement is perhaps the most important part of the game. The playing field is divided up into 5 lanes, labeled A through E. Each lane has 3 rows on each player's side. When you play a ship, you choose which lane to place it into, and then put it into the row closest to the center. If there are no other ships in that lane, then it goes to the front row. If there are 2 ships in the lane, then it goes to the back row. Ships can move spaces left or right, up or down, equal to their movement value. A ship that is moving must take all of their movement at once. You can't move a ship one space, move a different ship one space, and then move the first ship the rest of its movement. It's all or nothing. Ships cannot move through other ships. If you want to move a ship through a space occupied by another ship, you must first move the second ship out of the way, or have enough movement to go around. Lanes do not wrap around. You cannot normally move from lane A to lane E with one movement. You have to go the long way. Diagonal movement is not allowed. Once all ships are done moving, any ships that have empty spaces in front of them move up as far as they can. Now that the offensive player has moved, the offensive player declares if they are planning to attack. A player must have at least 5 influence points to be able to declare an attack. If they do not declare an attack, then skip the combat phase and go directly to the discard phase. If they do declare an attack, then the combat phase begins. Now combat is where the game gets complicated, and not in a it's only complicated at first but as you get used to it it becomes simple kind of way. No, it starts out really complicated, and as you get used to it, it becomes only moderately complicated. It doesn't help that the rules as written are not very user-friendly. It took me many rereads while trying to play the game to figure it out. First things first, the defensive player may move their ships around just like the offensive player did. Next, the defensive player may play tactic cards and declare targets for their squadrons to attack, followed by the offensive player doing the same. Tactic cards are pretty self-explanatory. They're like instants or sorceries in Magic. Play them, pick a target, get an effect. Squadrons take a bit more explaining. Squadrons are your small units, akin to fighter craft in real life. Or if you prefer sci-fi examples, X-Wings from Star Wars, Vipers from Battlestar Galactica, and Gunstars from The Last Starfighter. There are 3 kinds of squadrons: fighters, bombers, and fighter-bombers. All squadrons have a defense stat. Fighters have an attack stat, bombers have a bombing stat, and fighter-bombers have both the attack and bombing stats. Fighters are able to damage other squadrons, bombers can damage fleets or the enemy home system, and you guessed it, fighter-bombers can do both. When you play a squadron card, you must place it on a card with a launch catapult, be it your home system, a base card, or a fleet ship. Now, there is no limit to how many squadrons these cards may hold, but there's a hard limit to how many squadrons it may launch each turn. When you launch a squadron, you pick a target. That is, anywhere you either want to cause damage or prevent your opponent from causing damage, be it a fleet ship or a home system. If the squadron is based on a system card, then it can target anywhere, unless you are the defensive player, in which case the enemy's home system is off limits. Squadrons based on a fleet ship can only target enemy ships in the same lane or an adjacent lane, or a home system. Though again, only the attacking player may target an enemy home system.
Everybody got that? Good!
If opposing squadrons show up at the same target, they fight. You can have multiple squadron battles happening on the same turn. Each player has their fighters target an opposing squadron. You may target a single enemy squadron with multiple of your fighters, but you cannot target enemy bombers until all enemy fighters have been targeted by at least one of your fighters in the battle. Fighter bombers do count as fighters for this. Each targeted squadron checks its defense against the combined attack power of all fighters attacking it. If the attack power is equal to or greater than the defense, the target squadron is destroyed. All damage is dealt simultaneously, and all destroyed squadrons on both sides are destroyed at the same time. Naturally, any crew or weapons on destroyed squadrons are also destroyed. Surviving bombers do not deal damage just yet. If a bomber, or fighter bomber, was targeted by an enemy squadron, if it survived, it must return to base. The target area was too hot to continue the mission. But if they hadn't been targeted by any enemy fighters, they continue on and will deal damage during the fleet combat phase. Squadron combat is now over.
Everybody got that? Good!
Okay, let's talk about fleets for a bit. Fleets are your large ships, akin to naval vessels in real life. Or if you prefer more sci-fi examples, think Star Destroyers, Battlestars, or Hammerhead Dreadnoughts. All fleets have 4 stats shown on their card. These are Attack, Support, Movement, and Defense. Attack is how much damage the fleet deals during combat. Support is how much damage the fleet deals if it is supporting in combat. Movement is how many spaces it can move, and defense is how much damage it can take before being destroyed. Quick note, defense cannot be reduced below 1. If a card would reduce a fleet's defense below 1, it remains at 1. Carrier fleets will also have a launch stat shown. The number on the launch stat is how many squadrons it may launch during the combat phase. So far, so simple. Let's get into combat. First off, before you can declare an attack, you must be able to produce at least 5 influence points from your cards. You don't have to pay that to attack, you just need the capacity to generate it. Now, you choose what to do with your ships in the front row. Attack, support an attack, or nothing. Ships in the second or third rows normally cannot attack or support. An attacking ship will attack whatever ship is in front of it. A supporting ship cannot attack as it is adding its support stat to the attack of a ship in an adjacent lane. A supporting ship can, however, be attacked. A ship that is doing nothing can also be attacked. If there's no defending ship in the same lane as an attacking ship, then you attack the opponent's home system and remove power points equal to the damage the fleet deals. Any bomber or fighter bomber squadrons that attack the enemy home system without being intercepted do double damage, so add up their total bombing factor and remove twice as many power points. Fleets that do encounter a defending ship total up the attack value of the attacking ship, the support factor of any supporting ships, and the bombing attack of any bomber and fighter bomber squadrons attacking that same ship. If that number is equal to or greater than the defense value of the defending ship, it is destroyed. But hold on, just like with squadron combat, you don't remove anything just yet. All damage dealt by both players is dealt simultaneously. So the defending player now gets to counterattack. They go through the same process that the attacking player went through. So yes, if they have a ship that is unopposed, they can attack the enemy home system directly as the defending player. Once the defending player has counterattacked, then all ships that have been destroyed on both sides are discarded.
Everybody got that? Good!
At this point, I need to explain that players also lose power points equal to the influence cost of any fleets and squadrons lost in combat. They do not, however, lose any power points for any personality cost of any of their lost units. They also do not lose any power for the cost of crew or weapons attached to those units. So, if I lose a fleet with an influence cost of 3, then I lose 3 power points. If that fleet had an influence cost of 3 and a personality cost of 1, and it had a weapon attached to it that cost 2 influence, I still only lose 3 power points. Combat is now over. Next is the discard phase. If the offensive player has more than 6 cards in their hand, they discard down to 6. After discarding, the offensive player ends their turn. They become the defensive player, and the defensive player is now the offensive player. Quick note, unlike most games, you don't lose or reshuffle your deck when you run out. You just keep playing at a disadvantage. You keep going back and forth until one player has lost all of their power points, leaving the other player as the regional power in that corner of the galaxy. Now, I did leave a few things out of this tutorial, such as the optional rules for 3 or 4 players, which I have not tried out for myself. So if you do plan on playing the game, make sure to read the rules for yourself. Read them several times. You'll need to. Eventually you'll figure it out, but frankly it takes more dedication than a casual player will have the patience for. The gameplay is reminiscent of Magic the Gathering, but the lane system is such a major difference that it gives Star of the Guardians a very distinct feel. I also like the effective minimum hand size of 3. It helps keep the game running. Star of the Guardians is easily one of the least Magic-like of the Magic clones out there. The combat is obviously much deeper, and requires a lot more planning to position your ships to the greatest advantage. Tying the destruction of your ships to your life total is an interesting mechanic, which makes perfect sense from an in-universe point of view. You're trying to build up your power base, but if you lose ships, your power base is being undermined. Hypothetically, I would think this makes for a slower, more cautious style of play, but I'd be interested to see how accurate that hypothesis proves to be in a tournament. I'm not sure it would actually stop high-level players from creating heavily aggressive decks. I do wish that there were victory conditions other than just reducing your opponent's power points to 0. Perhaps being able to reach an upper limit of power points first, or some other means to earn a diplomatic victory? Perhaps a way to destroy an enemy home system. I'm not entirely certain what would work, but it would be nice to have some other options. So is Star of the Guardians worth collecting? If you're a player, I'd say so. I do think there's a good game here. I admit that the game is dragged down a bit by the complexity. The learning curve for new players is daunting, and the rules as written are not helping matters at all. But overall, I think there's a good game here. The lane system alone provides enough combat depth to make it worth trying out at least, especially since you can still find sealed starters and boosters for pretty low prices. Just keep in mind that the game plays fairly poorly out of starter decks because they don't have enough resources. You want to thin your decks out by 10-ish cards if you try sealed play. But you should find constructed play satisfying. If nothing else, it's different enough and cheap enough to provide a new experience for a game night or two. Just remember to put restrictions on the Armored Marine Landing Barge. It's pretty OP. So what about collectors who don't care about the game itself as much? Is it worth it for them to pursue Star of the Guardians? Well, that depends on what you're looking for as a collector. If you want a game that's easy to collect and complete, then Star of the Guardians should be at the top of your list. It's not difficult to find sealed product, and it's pretty inexpensive. With only a single set released, it's pretty easy to complete, too. The only cards that are difficult to find are 2 promo cards. Expect to wait a while for them to show up, and to pay a decent amount for them once you do find them. They're pretty rare. But if ease of collection isn't something you care about, then the only reason to collect Star of the Guardians is if you're a fan of either the book series itself or of Margaret Weis in general. Barring that, there's no real reason to pursue collecting this game. It was never popular, it's not valuable, and the art is not a reason to collect. Star of the Guardians the game came about as many CCGs in the 90s did. Magic the Gathering had become a huge hit and was being played by many a nerd. In this particular case, the nerds in question were Margaret Weis and Don Perrin, who were married at the time. Don Perrin was a Canadian military man, having served as a captain in the Canadian Corps of Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. After leaving the military, Don had a lot of different jobs, including some game development where he worked on board and miniatures games in the late 80s and early 90s. Margaret Weis is a well-known name among nerds. After graduating college with a degree in creative writing and literature, she was able to break into the publishing industry when she was hired as a proofreader at a book publisher and rather quickly rose to an editing position. Eventually, she got a position as a book editor at TSR, where she and frequent co-author Tracy Hickman wrote the famous Dragonlance novels, which are still some of the most beloved novels in all of fantasy. As mentioned before, Margaret and Don quite enjoyed playing Magic the Gathering, but Margaret thought they could make a better game. After all, Don had experience with tabletop games, and she had experience with RPGs from her time at TSR. While they were both busy, they found time to work out their superior version of Magic, often working on the design while they were driving to various appointments. I trust that they were responsible drivers and did not actually playtest while driving. If they did, well, I'd actually be rather impressed that they could do that without crashing. So Margaret and Don started up a company called Mag47, after an elite group of mercenaries in the Star of the Guardians books. Looking at the credits for the game, while a lot of people are listed under the Our Thanks section, Don and Margaret are the only 2 people listed as having actually worked on the game itself. Mag47 was literally just the 2 of them. They certainly had help making the game. For instance, they had connections at Wizards of the Coast, who invited them to their office where they shared with Don and Margaret their process for creating magic and the then upcoming game Jihad. They also taught them how to use desktop publishing and layout software. But aside from that, unless you count the playtesters or artists as having worked on the game, all of the real work on Star of the Guardians was done by Don and Margaret alone. And while they are listed as having different roles, they both admit that both of them worked on all aspects of the game. They merely took lead on different parts. Keeping this information in mind, the incredibly basic nature of the card layout and design makes a lot more sense. The entire game was put together by only 2 people who, despite having worked on games before, were still new to publishing and were learning as they went. Eventually, they managed to get the core set finished and printed, and worked out a distribution deal with White Wolf, the creators of the famous World of Darkness role-playing games. This was a big deal because in the 90s, White Wolf was probably the second largest RPG company in the United States, behind TSR but way ahead of everybody else. The game finally reached store shelves in April of 1995, to moderate success. It wasn't a bestseller, but CCGs were still red-hot items, and a game with Margaret's name attached to it that was being distributed by White Wolf was never going to be ignored. Star of the Guardians only had a single release. The base set consisted of 278 game cards and 7 reference cards. It was distributed in 60-card starter decks that came in boxes of 12 and 15-card booster packs that came in boxes of 36. One interesting point about the boxes is that they are the same size for both starter decks and booster packs. But they were clearly designed to accommodate the starter decks. You can tell because 12 starter decks fit perfectly into the box, but 36 booster packs isn't actually enough to fill the whole thing. There's a small slab of styrofoam at the bottom of each booster box to fill the remaining space. I've never seen this in any other booster box before. It's possible it happened with other games, but I haven't personally run across it myself yet. I assume that using a single box size was a cost-saving measure. Even with the extra styrofoam at the bottom, it was likely cheaper than paying for 2 different-sized boxes. Speaking of boosters and starters, they both have a pretty simple design, mostly blue with lots of text. The booster packs cost $2.95 when they were released in 1995, which after inflation would come to roughly $6.15 at the start of 2025. They come with 14 game cards and 1 reference card. However, none of these will be system cards, which are the basic resources. You can find special system cards in the boosters, but they are all rares, so you won't find a lot of them. This means you will need at least 1 starter deck to build a deck. Preferably 2, because the starters don't come with enough system cards for a 60-card deck. It's enough for a 40-card deck, sure, and probably enough for a 50-card deck, but it's definitely not enough for a 60-card deck. The starters cost $8.95 in 1995, which comes out to roughly $18.60 today. The starter decks include 60 cards and the rule sheet. There are no reference cards because the rule sheet already has all the reference cards printed on it. Now, Star of the Guardians shipped with a sheet instead of a booklet for 2 reasons. The first reason is it was a cost-saving measure. Folding paper is cheaper than stapling and cutting it. The second reason was so that the reverse side of the rules could act as a playmat. I believe this makes Star of the Guardians the first CCG to have an official playmat. Unfortunately, it's not really a good playmat due to all of the folds in it. Unless you're planning to literally iron out the wrinkles and laminate the sheet, it's not worth using. As mentioned earlier, each booster pack does have an extra reference card, and when you get enough of them, you'll have the equivalent of a playmat. It's not a perfect solution, but it works. The card layout is similarly efficient. There's not a lot to comment on, positive or negative. It's a fairly normal Magic-inspired card layout, though the card names and card types have switched places compared to the standard. Probably the most interesting thing worth pointing out is that the text boxes are of variable sizes. The art takes up most of the card by default, and the text boxes are placed on top of the art, but they only take up as much room as they need. I actually really like this. In most games, there's a specific budget for art and text with no room for variance. It can make complicated cards difficult to read, or limit the art space for a card with nothing special going on. Star of the Guardians doesn't have that problem. The backs of the cards are frustratingly boring. The design idea isn't terrible. It represents one of the titular stars held by the titular Guardians. The problem is that it's just some white lines on a blue background with a gradient. They don't even have the name of the game on the back. Scry magazine gave Star of the Guardians the award for CCG artifact most likely to confuse archaeologists, because the back of the cards are so basic and provide so little information about the game. Though, in all fairness, it should be noted that while Star of the Guardians was the first CCG to not print its name on the card backs, it would certainly not be the last. The art overall is okay. For the most part, it's not bad really, but there's very little of it that's good. There are some cards that have art taken from the novel's cover art that are excellent, but most of the good artwork is to be found on the various system cards. Those are easily the best of the set. They could have been the covers of science fiction novels from the 70s or 80s. Coming from me, that's high praise. But most of the rest of the art is merely sufficient. The artwork for the various spaceships especially is, well, it gets the job done. I do like how varied the ship designs are and how many of the ships are shown to be related via similar design philosophies. It's a neat bit of universe building, but that's about all the praise I can give it. On the flip side of the coin, just as there's not much good art, there's very little of the art that's bad. There are a few bad pieces here and there, but overall the problem with the art is that it's just so very bland, which actually makes the art surprisingly hard to poke fun at. As if I would let that stop me. This is Admiral Axe. This is Admiral Axe Bar. So this weapon is basically just an X-Men character? I mean, she's a good one to pick, don't get me wrong. I really like the Chiron ticker at the bottom of the frame. It sells the art like you're actually watching a cheesy TV ad that only runs at 3 a.m. Wait, didn't I just do this one?
I don't say sabotage. You say sabotage. I say sabotage.
Looks like Ethan Hunt is still at it after all these years.
Look, I can't hold forever. If you reach him, tell him Leia has an urgent message for him about his mother.
Open fire!
Man, if only I had had this card back when Windows 95 was still a thing. I'm in. This is one of the most relatable pieces of art I have ever seen in a CCG. Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the starship Caligula. Its 5-turn mission: to explore strange new systems, to seek out new wind conditions, to boldly go and defeat the opponent. Taking a break from the jokes, this character is based on James Ward, who used to work at TSR, as well as many other companies working on various nerd games. James made many great contributions to both role-playing games and collectible card games, but he died in 2024, and I would like to hold a short moment of silence for him. There are some other characters in the game that I feel might also be based on real-life people. For example, I'm convinced that Warlord Murphy is just a self-portrait of artist Kevin Murphy. No, different Kevin Murphy. Neither Don nor Margaret could remember if they had put anyone else into the game like they had with James, so for now, I can't say with certainty that they did put more of their friends into the game, but I'm going to work on the assumption they did. If any of these character portraits look like a game developer, artist, writer, or just friend of Don or Margaret's that you are aware of, please let me know. Star of the Guardians was somewhat lucky to have come out in April. It managed to get a bit of a head start compared to most of the games released that year. That meant it was able to grab shelf space in stores without too much fuss, especially since it was a science fiction themed game in a field of mostly fantasy. Coming out so early also meant that it was able to get reviewed by magazines much earlier than other games. I'm not sure how many of you understand how big of a deal this was back in the 90s. The internet was still very new. Even among nerds, not very many people used it at all, let alone regularly. Most nerds, and people in general, got their news either from word of mouth or from print magazines running on a subscription model. And magazines had hard limits on how much space they could dedicate to anything. You need to understand that articles usually had to be submitted several months in advance of the actual release of the magazine, so they would have time to lay everything out, get it printed, and then mailed out to stores and subscribers. So if, like Star of the Guardians, you released in a month with only one other new game and a small handful of expansions, then the magazines are going to be able to fit you into their schedule pretty quickly. If, however, like Wing Commander, you released in a month with 9 other new games and at least as many expansion sets, who knows how long it would take for any particular magazine to get to you. Unless you're paying well for advertising, you might already be irrelevant by the time they notice you. So yeah, the April release was likely a big contributor to its initial success. But as the year went on, more CCGs were released and less money was coming in. Margaret and Don had been designing an expansion set, and the initial success of the base set had convinced them to release it. Unfortunately, they weren't as wise with their business expenses as they could have been. Likely because while they had experience in the gaming industry, this was the first time they had been in charge of the business. They were still noobs in that regard and had a lot to learn about budgeting and whatnot. Ultimately, this resulted in them not having enough money to be able to pay for all of the art they would need for the expansion. So even though they had mostly finished the expansion, they set it aside and shifted their focus to finishing development on the Wing Commander CCG, which would release just 4 months later in August. If everything went well with that game, they would likely be able to afford the art necessary to finish the expansion to Star of the Guardians and get it published. Sadly, that was not meant to be. Wing Commander was not financially successful, which meant that the Star of the Guardians expansion never materialized. Things were looking shaky for Mag Force 7, but they weren't down and out just yet. Margaret and Don still had one more CCG in them, so for the time being, Mag Force 7 was still in business. But Star of the Guardians as a game was over, and there's not likely to be a rebirth of the game either. The files that did exist for the game, both for the base set and the expansion, were lost or destroyed long ago. The books would continue, as in the following years, Margaret and Don would co-write more novels in that universe. But while those books would be a welcome return for fans of the originals, they wouldn't rekindle any interest in the CCG. Star of the Guardians is an interesting tale in a meta sense. It came and went without much fanfare, but that was mostly because of when it came out. It's a solid game. It's not perfect, but it's definitely solid. Whether or not it was a better game than Magic is certainly up for debate. With a couple of expansions to sand off the rough edges, it could have been great. Under normal market conditions, there's a good chance it would have lasted for a few years before petering out with a small but loyal fanbase still talking about it decades later. But it came out during the glut. While it was successful by certain metrics, there were so many other games coming out at the same time that it just didn't have any way to stand out from the crowd. Attaching the name of a well-known and beloved author just wasn't enough. The IP didn't have the strength of something like Star Trek or Dungeons & Dragons. The art was nowhere near as good as games like Dark Age or Guardians. There was nothing controversial about it like Heresy or Cult. And the game didn't even release any expansions. There was almost nothing about it for the public to latch onto. If it were released today, exactly as it was back then, it would still be hard for people to remember it. But back during the glut?
Hey, forget about it.
Forget about it.
Forget about it.
Fortunately for Mag Force 7, even though Star of the Guardians wasn't as successful as they needed it to be, that didn't spell the end of their company. Unlike many other CCG startups during that time, they actually went on to create a couple more games. But those are histories for another time. We'd like to thank you for attending this tour of Star of the Guardians, and we hope you'll come back for more tours. Once again, we're still new at video production, and we welcome any suggestions or comments you have that can help us improve. If you enjoy what you've been seeing and would like to help us record the history of CCGs, feel free to contact us. We're a tiny operation and would be happy to talk to industry insiders or receive donations. Once again, have fun out there, and always remember to cut the deck.